You're standing inside the Theodosian walls at dawn, and the first thing you notice is the silence beyond them. No merchants calling out. No cart wheels on stone. Just empty plains stretching toward a horizon where, on some mornings, you can see the smoke from enemy camps. This is Constantinople in the 1300s, and for the people inside these walls, the world has shrunk to what they can grow, store, and move within a perimeter that hasn't changed in 900 years. 1 million people lived here once. Now it's maybe 200,000 on a good year, but the question isn't how many are left. It's how they're still eating when everything outside wants them gone. This isn't a city that grew too big for its logistics. This is a city whose logistics had to survive when everything else collapsed. The trade routes that fed the Roman Empire are gone. The grain fleets from Egypt stopped coming centuries ago. The roads that connected Constantinople to Anatolia are controlled by enemies who change every few decades but never stop threatening. And yet the city endures, not thriving, not expanding, but enduring in a way that shouldn't be possible when you look at a map and realize how alone it actually is. The walls are the first system, not just defense, infrastructure. They're 14 miles of stone wrapping around the peninsula, with the Sea of Marmara to the south and the Golden Horn to the north. Water on 3 sides means food can still come by sea when the land routes are cut, which is most of the time now. But it also means the city is trapped in a shape it can't escape. There's no sprawl here, no suburbs. You're either inside the walls or you're not, and if you're not, you're on your own. We're walking south from the gate of Carisius, down the Mies, the main avenue that runs like a spine through the city. It's wider than most streets, paved with stones that have been here since Justinian's time, and it's lined with buildings that are slowly falling apart. Not from war, from emptiness. Whole neighborhoods inside these walls are abandoned now. Gardens and orchards grow where houses used to stand. It sounds pastoral until you realize this is what contraction looks like. The city is cannibalizing its own space to stay fed. Those gardens aren't ornamental, they're survival. When you can't rely on food coming from outside, you grow it inside. Vegetables, fruit trees, chickens in courtyards. There are olive groves within sight of the hippodrome, vineyards on slopes that used to be residential districts. It's not enough to feed everyone, but it's enough to take the edge off the dependence on external supply. And that edge matters when a siege can start without warning and last for months. What surprised me when I started tracing how this worked is how much of the city's food supply is controlled by monasteries. Not the emperor, not the guilds, the monasteries. They own vast tracts of land both inside and outside the walls, and they've been accumulating it for centuries through donations, purchases, and imperial grants. The monastery of Stoudios alone controls enough farmland to feed thousands. They grow wheat, barley, vegetables. They raise livestock. They produce wine and olive oil. And because they're religious institutions, they're supposed to distribute some of this to the poor. Supposed to. But here's the reality. The monasteries operate like independent economies. They have their own warehouses, their own storage systems, their own networks of dependent farmers who work the land and pay rent in kind. When food gets scarce, the monasteries don't go hungry. The rest of the city does. It's not a conspiracy. It's just how power works when resources are tight. The institutions with land survive. Everyone else makes do. We're passing through the Forum of Constantine now. There's a column here, a massive porphyry pillar that's been standing since the city was founded, and at its base there's a grain market. Not as grand as it used to be. Not as crowded, but it's still operating because grain is still the foundation of everything. Bread is what keeps people alive when meat and fish and vegetables become luxuries. The grain comes from Thrace mostly, the countryside just beyond the walls to the west. It's the only land route that's been semi-reliable, and even that depends on who controls the territory this year. Byzantine farmers work the fields under the protection of fortified towns, and when harvest comes, the grain is carted to Constantinople under armed escort. Sometimes it makes it, sometimes it doesn't. There are years when the caravans are raided and the city goes on rationing for months. But when the land routes fail, there's still the sea. The Black Sea trade is the lifeline that's kept Constantinople alive for centuries. Ships come down through the Bosporus carrying grain, salted fish, honey, wax, furs, timber. They dock at the Golden Horn on the northern side of the peninsula, where the water is calm and deep enough for large vessels. This is where the city's commercial heart still beats, though it's not beating as strongly as it used to. The Genoese control much of the trade now. They have their own quarter across the Golden Horn in Galata, and they operate with a level of autonomy that would have been unthinkable 200 years ago. But Constantinople needs them, needs their ships, needs their connections to the wider Mediterranean. So the emperors grant concessions, and the Genoese merchants grow rich moving goods that used to make Byzantine traders wealthy. It's humiliating in a way that everyone pretends not to notice. We're walking down to the harbor now, past the old shipyards that are mostly idle. The ships tied up here are smaller than they used to be, fewer of them, but they're still carrying the essentials. A ship from Trebizond unloading barrels of salted mackerel, another from the Crimea with amphorae of wine, a third from Thessaloniki, one of the few other Byzantine cities still standing, bringing olive oil and dried figs. The unloading is slow. There aren't enough dock workers anymore. The guilds that used to organize labor have weakened as the population declined, and now it's a chaotic scramble of whoever is available and willing. The merchants complain, but there's no one to complain to. The imperial bureaucracy that used to regulate every detail of commerce is a shadow of itself. Positions that used to be coveted posts are now unfilled because there's no money to pay salaries. But here's what hasn't disappeared: the systems of storage. Constantinople was built to withstand sieges, and that means it was built to store food. There are cisterns under the city that can hold millions of gallons of water. Massive underground chambers with vaulted ceilings held up by hundreds of columns, filled from aqueducts that stretch miles into the countryside. The Basilica cistern is the most famous, but there are dozens of them scattered throughout the city, some still in use, others forgotten and flooded. The grain warehouses are above ground, clustered near the harbors. Stone buildings with thick walls and small windows to keep out moisture and pests. In better times, these warehouses held enough grain to feed the city for a year. Now there may be a third full on a good season, but the infrastructure is still there. The knowledge is still there. The city remembers how to prepare for the worst because the worst keeps happening. We're climbing now up from the harbor into the residential districts that cling to the hills. The streets are narrower here, twisting and steep, and the houses are packed close together. This is where most people live now, in the central districts where services and markets are still accessible. The outer districts near the land walls are increasingly empty. Too dangerous, too far from supplies, too exposed. There's a bakery on this corner that's been operating for 3 generations. The baker buys his flour from a merchant near the harbor who sources it from the grain market at the Forum of Constantine. It's the same chain you'd find in any city, but here it feels more fragile. The baker tells you he never knows from week to week if the flour will arrive. Sometimes the price doubles overnight because a caravan was attacked or a ship was delayed. Sometimes there's no flour at all and he closes for days until supply returns. But people need bread. So when the wheat runs out, they adapt. Barley bread, which is coarser and cheaper. Bean flour mixed with whatever grain is available. In the worst times, bread made from acorns or chestnuts, which fills the stomach but barely nourishes. It's enough to prevent starvation, but just barely. enough to keep people alive but weak. What's easy to forget is that Constantinople in this era isn't just under external pressure. It's under internal strain. The population isn't evenly distributed. There are wealthy neighborhoods near the palace where you'd barely know the city was struggling. Mansions with courtyards and private wells. Households that can afford imported luxuries even when the rest of the city is rationing. And then there are the slums near the land walls where people live in buildings that are barely standing, surviving on whatever they can scavenge or beg. The church tries to bridge the gap. Soup kitchens run by monasteries, bread distributions in the forums, but it's not systematic. It's not reliable. It depends on donations and the charity of institutions that are themselves struggling. In good years, it's enough. In bad years, people starve quietly in corners of the city that the authorities don't visit. We're passing through the district near the Church of the Holy Apostles now. This used to be one of the grandest parts of the city, filled with aristocratic homes and public buildings. Now half the structures are in ruins, their materials scavenged for other construction projects. But there are still people here, living in the shells of old buildings, growing vegetables in what used to be courtyards. It's a strange kind of urbanism. A city turning itself inside out, becoming part fortress, part farm, part ghost town. And then there's the question of water. The cisterns can store it, but they have to be filled, and that means the aqueducts have to function. The aqueduct of Valens cuts across the city, a massive stone structure that's been carrying water since the 4th century. But it's vulnerable. Every time an enemy army camps outside the walls, one of their first moves is to cut the aqueduct. It's not hard. A few breaks in the arches and the flow stops. When that happens, the city falls back on wells and cisterns. But wells can run dry and cisterns only hold what was stored before the siege began. So water gets rationed. Public fountains are turned off. Private wells are guarded. People start hoarding, filling every container they have, and the price of a bucket of clean water can quadruple in a week. I'm standing near the Forum of Theodosius now, and there's a public fountain here that's been dry for months. No one knows if it's because the aqueduct is damaged or because the flow has been diverted elsewhere. The city's infrastructure is so old and so patched together that sometimes things just stop working and no one has the resources to figure out why. But people adapt. They always adapt. There's a network of water carriers who fill barrels from working fountains and sell it by the bucket in neighborhoods where the supply has failed. It's not cheap. It's not clean. But it's water, and that's enough. We're heading back toward the Mies now, and the sun is higher. The streets are more crowded. Market stalls are opening, though the goods on display are sparse. A vegetable seller with a few cabbages and onions. A fishmonger with a single basket of small fish from the Marmara. A woman selling eggs, 2 copper coins each. This is what commerce looks like in a city under pressure. Not abundance. Not variety, just enough to get through today. And that's the rhythm of life here. Not planning for next year. Not investing in the future, just making it through today and then tomorrow and then the day after that. It's exhausting in a way that's hard to describe. The constant low-level anxiety of not knowing if the grain ships will arrive next week, if the aqueduct will be cut, if the gates will hold if another siege comes. But here's the thing that keeps striking me as I walk these streets. This city has been doing this for centuries, surviving, adapting, shrinking but not disappearing. The systems are old and fragile and barely holding together, but they're still here. The walls still stand. The cisterns still fill when the aqueducts work. The markets still open. The bread still gets baked. Constantinople doesn't feed 1 million people anymore, but it feeds the people who remain. And it does so inside walls that are both protection and prison, using logistics that are both ancient and improvised, in a state of permanent semi-crisis that everyone has learned to accept as normal. I'm standing at the Golden Gate now, the ceremonial entrance on the southern stretch of the walls. It's closed. It's been closed for years. Emperors used to ride through here in triumph after military victories. Now there are no triumphs, no grand entrances, just the slow, grinding work of keeping a city alive when the world outside has moved on. And somewhere beyond these walls, the next threat is forming. It always is. But inside, the cisterns are full. The granaries have enough for a few months, the gardens are growing, and tomorrow the grain ships might arrive. Or they might not. Either way, the city will still be here. It always is.